In 1917, when the United States entered the First World War, many European leaders did not take America seriously. At that time, the U.S. Army counted barely 98,000 men. Compared to the massive, battle-hardened armies of Europe, America looked inexperienced, distant, and untested. Some European elites mocked the United States as a nation of farmers and merchants. Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed America as a weak and divided society, but Europe was exhausted. After 3 years of brutal trench warfare, millions were dead. France had lost an entire generation of young men. Britain was financially drained. Germany was stretched thin. The continent was bleeding. And then America arrived. More than 2 million American soldiers crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They came not as conquerors, but as reinforcements for a collapsing front. Young men from farms, factories, and cities stepped onto French soil, knowing little about European politics, but fully aware they were walking into history. They trained quickly, they adapted quickly, and they fought fiercely. On the Western Front, American troops entered some of the most brutal battlefields of the war. At Belleauwood in 1918, U.S. Marines fought for 3 relentless weeks in a forest shattered by artillery and machine gun fire. The trees were splintered, the air was filled with smoke and screams. German forces believed the Americans would break. They did not. Wave after wave, American soldiers pushed forward through mud, barbed wire, and heavy fire. Casualties were devastating, but their advance changed the momentum of the war. American artillery units fired relentlessly to support infantry assaults. Medics rushed into open fire to pull wounded men from the battlefield. Young soldiers who had never left their hometowns before 1917 now stood in European trenches, soaked in mud and fear, holding the line. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, over 116,000 Americans had died on European soil. The arrival of the United States did not merely add numbers to the battlefield, it shifted the balance of power. German command understood that they could not win a prolonged war against fresh American manpower and industrial strength. America's entry made defeat inevitable. When the guns fell silent, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were shattered, economies were broken. Entire regions were scarred beyond recognition. And yet, America did not demand territory. It did not occupy Europe as an empire. Instead, it returned home, leaving behind graves of its sons scattered across foreign land. This was the first time in modern history that the United States crossed an ocean to fight and die for European stability. After the victory in 1918, Europe lay in ruins. Millions of bodies scattered across the fields of France and Belgium stood as silent reminders of the price paid for imperial ambition. France had lost more than 1.4 million soldiers. Great Britain, over 900,000. Germany, more than 2 million. And America, it had lost more than 116,000 of its sons, crossing an ocean to save Europeans who had once mocked its provincial character. Yet the lessons of war were quickly forgotten. European nations gradually lost their fear of the consequences of their own ambitions. Germany, crushed by reparations, slowly rebuilt its industrial strength. France and Great Britain remained economically drained and politically fragile. After the trauma of war, the United States attempted to distance itself from European conflicts, focusing instead on domestic growth and the economic prosperity of the Roaring Twenties. And yet, even during this period, America did not abandon Europe. American diplomacy sought to shape peace settlements, promote stability, and encourage international cooperation. But the weakness of European governments and their inability to act collectively turned peace into a fragile illusion. By the 1930s, Europe was once again descending into political chaos. The Great Depression shattered the economies of France, Great Britain, and Italy, opening the door to radical movements. Meanwhile, Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, rose under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. He promised to restore Germany's greatness, and instead of preparing for potential war, Europe's democracies chose appeasement. In 1938, Neville Chamberlain traveled to Munich and conceded the Sudetenland to Hitler, hoping to preserve peace. Within 2 years, Germany invaded Poland. France and Great Britain proved unable to stop the armored divisions of the Wehrmacht. France collapsed in just 6 weeks. The British Army escaped only through the evacuation at Dunkirk, leaving behind equipment, artillery, and wounded pride. Americans watched from across the Atlantic. They saw Europe once again ignoring the lessons written in blood, becoming a victim of its own inaction. But the United States understood that a conflict consuming Europe would inevitably reshape the global order and eventually reach America itself. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The American response was immediate and relentless. American industry surged with unprecedented force. Factories operated around the clock, producing tanks, aircraft, ships, weapons, and ammunition. Through Lend-Lease, the United States supplied not only Great Britain, but also the Soviet Union, China, and other allied nations. American money, resources, and human sacrifice became the foundation of Europe's survival. In 1944 came the largest amphibious invasion in history, the landings in Normandy. On Omaha Beach, American soldiers stormed the shoreline under devastating machine gun fire, losing more than 2,000 men in a single morning assault. From Caen to Paris, from the Rhine to Berlin, American forces shed blood to restore freedom to a continent. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 claimed another 19,000 American lives. When the war ended, Europe once again lay devastated. But this time, the United States assumed not only military responsibility, but economic reconstruction as well. Between 1948 and 1951, the Marshall Plan provided more than $13 billion in aid, over $150 billion in today's value, rebuilding factories, infrastructure, and feeding populations. America prevented famine, economic collapse, and political chaos. At the same time, the United States solidified its presence in Europe, military bases, troops, advanced technology, and a nuclear umbrella shielded the continent from the Soviet Union. Americans were doing what Europe could not, and often would not, do itself, investing blood, resources, and security guarantees to protect foreign nations, remaining generous even as those nations gradually began to forget who had saved them. Yet this historical lesson was often ignored. Europe enjoyed peace and prosperity, slowly forgetting the price Americans had paid. And when modern challenges emerged, many leaders continued to rely on American support, even while criticizing it, as has increasingly happened in the 21st century. After the Second World War, Europe once again lay in ruins. Millions were dead, cities were devastated, economies were shattered. The political map of the continent had been permanently redrawn. France, Great Britain, and Germany were economically exhausted. The Soviet Union, having pushed back German forces, quickly consolidated control over Eastern Europe. Western Europe stood on the brink of chaos, lacking both the strength and the resources to defend itself. America, having sacrificed millions of lives and expended colossal resources, once again assumed responsibility for the security of the continent. In 1948, Stalin blockaded West Berlin, attempting to force the Allies to abandon a city of 2 million people. Western Europe was effectively powerless. The United States responded by organizing the Berlin Airlift, a massive operation in which American and British pilots delivered 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, and medicine over 15 months. At the height of the operation, an aircraft landed every 30 seconds. 31 American airmen lost their lives, flying in dangerous weather conditions to sustain a divided city. This was only the first demonstration of American resolve to defend Europe. In 1949, NATO was formed, a military alliance that became the symbol of America's commitment to the continent. The United States guaranteed the protection of Western Europe against Soviet aggression, stationing thousands of conventional and nuclear forces on Allied territory. At the height of the Cold War, more than 430,000 American troops stood guard in Germany, Italy, Great Britain, Spain, and Turkey, ensuring a peace that European nations could not guarantee on their own. American nuclear missiles were deployed in Europe, making any attack on NATO allies unthinkable without risking global catastrophe. Technology, weapons systems, logistics, all were financed by American taxpayers. Meanwhile, Europe built welfare states, funding long vacations, free universities, and generous pensions while remaining under the American security umbrella. For decades, Europe gradually and systematically reduced its own military spending. Germany cut its armed forces from over 500,000 troops to fewer than 200,000. Its tank fleet shrank from roughly 2,000 to around 300. Great Britain conducted repeated defense reviews that steadily reduced budgets. By the late 20th century, Europe's security depended heavily on American resources. From Eisenhower to Reagan, American presidents repeatedly reminded allies of the need for burden sharing, yet most European governments continued to rely on U.S. protection. It was an alliance built on American sacrifice. The United States provided peace and security. Europe often responded with criticism and demands. Amid these developments, in 2026 American leaders announced renewed strategic interest in Greenland, an Arctic island where the United States has maintained a military base since 1951. The reaction from European allies was swift and critical. Denmark, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, and Poland issued a joint statement opposing the American position. It was a familiar pattern. Nations that had relied for decades on the American security umbrella now publicly questioned American strategic interests. Denmark maintained fewer troops than the New York City Police Department. France and Germany had spent decades allocating under 2% of GDP to defense, while American taxpayers financed their security. Poland stood as an exception, investing over 4% of GDP in defense shaped by its historical experience under Soviet domination. Yet even Poland relied on U.S. support in critical moments. And still, when the United States asserted its national interests, several of these nations responded with criticism, often overlooking who had defended their borders for generations. Today, Europe consists of wealthy nations with the resources and technology to defend themselves, yet lacking the political will to do so fully. American troops stand along its eastern borders. American missiles deter aggressors. American factories supply ammunition. Meanwhile, European governments maintain expansive social programs and frequently criticize American policy. History appears to repeat itself. The United States pays in blood and resources for the security of those unwilling to bear the full burden themselves. This chapter of history reflects a century-long pattern. America intervenes twice in world wars to stabilize Europe. America guarantees stability during the Cold War. America supplies modern weapons and support to counter Russian aggression. Europe benefits from protection, yet questions American actions, often overlooking its own vulnerabilities. As long as American soldiers, factories, and taxpayers continue to shoulder the cost of continental security, Europe remains dependent. This is not merely a question of money or resources. It is a question of political will, sacrifice, and the readiness to pay for one's own freedom. Without that resolve, the United States will remain the primary guarantor of European security, and history will continue to repeat itself as it has for the past century.